So I want to ask you, as a backdrop for this conversation, which is not so much going to be about 2012 per se, but about the general way that the coverage of politics and presidential politics and campaigns has evolved. Let me ask you, though, just as a backdrop about the 2012 campaign. Were either of you surprised particularly about the way the coverage did or did not intersect with what was going on out on the campaign trail? Do you have any general observations about what you saw from the standpoint of how the media, the various media, traditional and non-traditional, covered this campaign? Matthew?
I wouldn't say surprised, because a lot of things are predictable, though they're not what you would want. Yeah. This was a race that the media kept trying to make bigger things out of things that happened than they actually were. This was a very stable race. Yeah. From May or June, when Mitt Romney clinched the nomination, until Election Day. And it was a race exceedingly similar to the 2004 re-elect, which an incumbent president was running against another candidate with authenticity problems from Boston, from Massachusetts.
We have a John Kerry fan in the back, apparently.
He'll make a great Secretary of State.
Right.
He'll make a great Secretary of State.
He won, just not the thing he wanted, so that's fine.
Maybe in the end he may want what he got. Right. But that's the thing that doesn't surprise me, but I wish would be different, because no matter, all of us, and Mark's in the media, I'm in the media now, and we constantly try to counsel people from this herd mentality. Something happens, an event happens, one poll changes or two poll changes, and then all of a sudden it's like the race is totally changed. This is what's happening, and the coverage of it flows that way for 4 or 5 days. There is a lack of real stability in the coverage that I think would give the public that every single thing that happens in a campaign isn't the most important thing that's happening in a campaign. Right. That's what happened a number of times in the course of this race. This race basically ended up almost exactly where it started in June, almost exactly where it started.
Mark, it's hard to argue with that, except for that first disastrous debate that the president had and some kind of response to that temporarily in the polls. We pretty much saw a consistent deal.
Yeah, the only really surprising thing about the race is the extent to which that one debate suddenly gave the impression to the media and a large part of the electorate, and Republicans particularly, that it was actually a race. You know, I mean, it was one blip in as Matthew said, an incredibly stable race. I mean, I was thinking, if you took that out of the equation, nobody would have thought Romney was going to win that race. I mean, and he couldn't have, and he shouldn't have, because of the kind of race that he ran. But everybody got deluded momentarily, and not just momentarily, but Republicans and donors. And this is part of confirmation bias. If you're part of any kind of campaign, you're always going to search for a reason to believe that you can win, right? I mean, you can't be the candidate or the people involved and not try and find something out there to hold on to believe that there's a way you can win. And so that debate, which was a spectacular moment. No, I'm not diminishing the importance of that moment. And that, by the way, that goes to the whole point of, you know, there are 3 things in a presidential election over which candidates actually have control of moving the numbers in a significant way. One is the announcement. 2 is your convention speech and VP nominee, and 3 is the debates. And this showed just how spectacularly you can actually impact the numbers. But it really was a momentary thing. But to Matthew's point, the worst thing possible, and to your question about the media, the a static environment is absolute death for the media.
It's not good for TV.
And particularly when you compound that with the sort of social media tools that we have today, where you don't want just news every cycle, you want new news every minute. And so they and consumers and voters are groping for any kind of information, and that's why we have this sort of distorted environment where everything is seeking to make news and change the dynamic when you really have a pretty static thing going on.
But I'm going to add one thing. I think that the one thing the media does very badly, and I know this is a conference on the media and how they look at things, is they have an inability to really focus on the macro dynamics going on, especially in political campaigns. They have a not a disregard, but a a tendency to always say it's this spot that was just put up, or it's a speech that just happened, without explaining to people what's really going on, the fundamentals that are really driving the race, what's really happening. There was they should have done a series. All of a sudden election day shows up and everybody's like, wow, there's a new America. This is not what we expected. The number of Latinos voting, and the number of African Americans voting, and the number of people that call themselves liberal, and the number of people that are secular, it's all of a sudden some shock to the system. All of us who watch this has been a coming trend. It would have been a very good thing for everybody if the media had sort of focused on, here's what the country looks like, and here's the dynamic that's being created of why Mitt Romney is going to have a very difficult time winning a race where he is a candidate looked like he was taken from the 1950s and put in 2012. And Barack Obama, not perfect by any means, and had made mistakes and in office and a number of things that you could have judged him on, was a candidate that much more fit the macro dynamics and the macro culture that's going on in America.
I mean, because Romney thought the Flintstones was a documentary?
But the problem with that is, at least in part, that if the press had done what Matthew's talking about, they would have been accused by people of calling the race before it actually happened. If they had said, well, the macro dynamics set up that Romney can't win this race because the country's changed and there are all these systemic problems with the idea of his candidacy being successful, the press would have gotten killed for having pronounced the race over.
I don't think that's what Matthew's saying. I think that there just needs to be a sort of calm reserve and not a lurch to momentary events and as the latest sort of glittering object to say, oh my God, this happened and it's going to fundamentally change the nature and the shape of the race, which was, perhaps not overt, but a way of the media trying to maintain interest, if not for their readers, even for themselves, and that's totally understandable. But just a couple of quick points. In terms of the nature of the race, we think a lot, and we talked a lot during the presidential races about how what we're communicating as communicators when we step back and think about what is it that we're trying to communicate about a presidential candidate. It's really not about issues, particularly at the presidential level. It's about attributes that you're trying to communicate. And the fundamental driving attributes for somebody running for president are the perception that they're a strong leader. Do they share your values? Do they have a vision and a plan? And I'm going to wait to tell you the fourth one, because on all three of those important attributes that we say are fundamental to winning a presidential election, and by the way, against Gore, the one we were constantly winning was bold leader against Gore while he was winning. But in this race, Romney was winning all those important three attributes by an average of 54 to 46. Okay? On the last attribute, which is in this case obviously the most important, cares about you, he lost 81 to 16. So that's just an interesting sort of sidelight about going back to this issue of where was the race sort of overall, and the extent to which Romney really had deep problems, and that was at the root of it, which was obviously very well exploited by the Obama campaign. But I'm going to tee up Matthew, if I may, here, because it kind of goes to another issue, which is the notion of a convenient narrative for the media, okay? Which is something happens and we want to say, oh, cause and effect, here's the big story. The big story this election cycle is big data, and it's all about how the Obama campaign had all these super nerds who drove down into micro-targeting and finding these audiences. And there's no question that obviously they did that well and arguably did it better than Romney campaign, but I'm going to tee you up to your last column.
You just wrote a column disabusing us of this idea.
Which is a great clarification.
And what Mark's talking about is, which again goes to this whole thing that we focus on the tactics. Tactics basically affect in a presidential race about 4 or 5% of what's going on. What's not talked about hardly at all is the 95% of what's going on, which is this whole macro thing. But let me give you one data point. Everybody said the Romney campaign, which was much better organized, much better done, much better television spot.
You mean Obama?
I mean the Obama campaign was much better television campaign, much better data, much better technology.
I'll let you run with that.
Much better field offices. If you take a look at the 12 states that the two campaigns targeted, right, and the 39 jurisdictions that weren't targeted, And you would think, your assumption would be that if all of that was true, that Obama would have overperformed in those 12 states, correct? That would be a natural assumption. He didn't. He actually underperformed in the 12 states. He had all the campaign offices, he had all the media done, and he had all the big data going on. Slightly underperformed, it's right around the edges, but statistically, there's no difference in it. And so this idea, which has now become a common myth, is that what won the election was big data, and let's go, and now the Republicans who lost the race are now buying into this, like we need to go and find our new big data stuff and fix the technology, when the fundamental thing they need to fix is that they don't fit America, is they don't fit the country today. When you look at what the country looks like and look at the candidates and the message that many Republicans, not all, but many Republicans have, they are not in line with them. And this is a typical thing that happens in all campaigns, and the media is a huge enabler of this. They now are repeating
complicit in not telling what actually happened.
Yeah, because because the winners always tell the story. The Obama campaign wants to say we did all these things great and these things had an effect. Now, obviously, you're much better positioned if you're doing those things well in a dynamic that favors you, obviously. But it is now become part of common wisdom that that's what won the election, or one of the main things that won in the election. And the bad thing for that is Republicans have bought into it.
We just need bigger computers.
Yeah. And we just need, and that's going to fix the problem.
Matthew, we heard a lot. We had Eric Erickson and Josh Trevino earlier in the day talking about the conservative media and to some degree the role that the conservative media played during this campaign, how they regarded Romney and all that. I want to ask you, we heard a lot during the campaign that the press was in the tank for Obama. And that one of the problems that Romney had was he never could break through the idea that the press was liberal and that the press just wanted Obama to win, and so they skewed their coverage. We even heard on the conservative blogs and on Fox News that the polls are skewed, and you're not being told the real story or the whole story, and in fact this is a much closer race than the press wants you to think. What about that?
Teleprompter.
Josephine. She's putting upside cue cards.
She's got teleprompter.
Good. I probably need it. I mean, I'm a believer, and Mark and I have worked on both sides of the aisle. And the press does, as we all do, every single person in this room, has a bias. And most of the press in the mainstream media comes into a bias that is more progressive or more liberal and more democratic than not. That's true. That's a story. I mean, I've worked with all of them. Much less of an impact today than not, but it doesn't mean that it controlled the race at all. And when you look at the people that seemed to be in the tank more than not were the people that were repeating this false idea that Mitt Romney was going to win the election. At least the mainstream media, if you say they were in the tank with Obama, they were actually repeating facts in the course of this race. The media does have a bias. Does it influence their coverage? Yeah, it does to a degree. Does it matter that it's going to determine the course of a race? No.
Yeah. Would you agree that the conservative media had more of a bias in this race?
Well, I just think that there is I think the echo chamber produced a lot of. I think this is a product of sort of isolating news today, which is just part of this whole media discussion, which is where's media gone, which is that we don't get broadcast media that everybody sees now. We all sort of pick and choose our own media. And the conservative media created their own echo chamber and creating, again, sort of grabbing confirmation bias pieces and throwing it out to keep hope alive on the conservative side of the aisle. But I don't really buy into the notion that there's this particular ideological bias. I do think there's a bias toward conflict, which again is understandable. They want to create a story, and I'd say if anything, probably the media was more geared toward a conflict that Romney might win because that created a more interesting story.
In a weird way, they were biased in favor of Romney.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was kind of a reverse effect, just to have some kind of an upset, and that. So I think that created, or just to make it a race, that made it much more interesting. I mean, imagine the coverage of that race if not for that debate. I mean, it would have been.
Well, people were pronouncing the election over, Matthew, before that debate. Had Romney done poorly in that first debate, it would have truly been over in the media's mind.
I'm going to sort of raise it up on the media a little bit. So I think that does the media want to they want to be perceived as credible. They want to cover the race. Besides some of the main channels like Fox and MSNBC and most of their programming, which has they're not really a news, neither one of them are really news networks. They're advocacy. Both of them are advocacy. ABC, CBS, NBC, are much more like, let's try to figure out what's going on, even with their bias. But this is not if you walk into a newsroom and a place that covers, they don't say, there's nobody sitting there saying like, I'm for Obama and let's figure out how to do this. There's a cultural, and I had this conversation actually in a meeting at ABC last week, where there was this whole conversation about diversity, right? This whole conversation about diversity. And everybody in the room was focused on, we need more Latino voices, we need more African American voices, we need more female voices. All true. But the problem in the room is diversity can be defined in many different ways. And if you looked at a room of many of the major networks, there is not people in that room that ever owned a gun. There's not people in that room that ever sort of been in different situations, that went to a rural college. That it is a cultural diversity. So when they sit there and have conversations, and let's say they're going to cover some conversation about people that go to church, right, every week. Their natural tendency is to say, those are interesting animals over there, those people that go to church every week.
Too bad we don't have one of those on our staff, right?
Why would somebody own a gun? We need to go find out what's going on here. And so it's not as if they have this, like, we're going to set up this election. There is just, in most of the major newsrooms in the country, and leave out like Fox and MSNBC, there is a cultural homogeneity that doesn't allow them to see a lot of what's actually going on in the country and how people actually live.
Right. I know that you're an employee of ABC and increasingly a power over there, but does anybody really give a crap about the networks?
Actually, actually the networks drive more of what happens in this time of presidential campaigns than they actually did 10 years ago, actually.
Yeah. Because
what's happened now is, Josephine, you're going to have to sit down, sweetheart. Please. I know the cake's getting to you. That the public, this is, I'm sure, a conversation you all have had over this weekend, there's thousands of different avenues now for information. So you have all of this information, and with a diminished credibility. So we've got increased amount of information, diminished credibility, and the public is searching, a big part of the public, not people, as Mark says, that are looking for confirmation bias, which in the end, if you take a look at the number of people that watch Fox and MSNBC, right, which is what, the number of people that watch Fox and MSNBC regularly is about 7 or 8 million people. The number of people that watch the three networks, while lower than it was, is 26 million people.
In fact, the lowest rated of the three networks probably has a higher number of viewers than
the combined, and Fox and MSNBC combined. But I'm not saying that they're not diminished, but in the course of a time when people are looking for credibility, 60 Minutes gets 17 million
right,
people.
The raw numbers are no doubt they're higher. But Mark, we can acknowledge the fact that the numbers that Matthew is quoting are correct, and at the same time, the conversation seems at least to be driven much more by Fox on the one side and MSNBC on the other than the networks. That seems to be where the heat is, even if the numbers aren't there.
Yeah, and I think that's where the people with the passion and the microphones are attracted.
And is that a good thing or a bad thing, generally speaking?
I think it's problematic. I mean, it's ultimately, I think the democratization of media is a good thing, but I think we're in the middle of the sort of the revolution, and I think that we will ultimately, this is going to all sort itself out over who knows how long, but people are they're in search of news that they can trust, and right now they're attracted to news that feels familiar to them or feels preaching to the choir. And so I think that there are consequences for that. I mean, I think I suffer from that. I don't think I get as broad I try proactively to sort of seek out and make sure that I'm not just looking at news that I want to hear, but I think that I know that I go to sites that, are full of news that fits my particular profile.
And I think the big thing it affects, where the situation is the primary process in both primary campaigns. And so the nominees that we each end up with in both political parties are Fox, to a large degree, controls or has huge influence over the Republican nomination process, huge influence over and so does talk radio. MSNBC and others have a huge influence over the Democratic nomination process. So their effect in a general election is diminished when 140 million people vote, but their effect is a great power in a process where 100,000 caucus attendees show up in Iowa, or 200,000 people vote in New Hampshire. And therefore, we end up with nominees that, instead of being as close to the center, which is where most of the country is, that that media influence creates a dynamic where you get further and further out. And that's a problem.
And I would say more broadly that, and this is a discussion that we could have for the rest of the night, but you ask anybody who's been in Congress, we can talk about, we say, oh, there's been times in our history where it's, things have been very partisan. Well, they didn't have they didn't have talk radio, they didn't have cable TV, they didn't have the internet, which has just been steroids for all of this. And so what it has done is it has provided huge amplifiers and microphones for voices that don't represent a majority, but rather a minority, sort of going to these primary ideas. And that, I think, has created greater consequences for governing.
Yeah.
That we can get into a lot more.
Do you think that Fox and MSNBC are creating a more toxic politics? And that's kind of it's almost a cliche at this point to say it. We hear almost all the time that the cable shows are the cause of all of this toxicity in politics. Is that overstated, or do you think that's the case?
I think it's a big contributor. Sure.
So then why are you on MSNBC?
Because I'm trying to lend a different voice there. I'm trying to provide a Republican voice
Solve the problem
to an audience
from within.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm trying to say that there are Republicans out here with a different voice, and it's not just what you see on Fox News.
I think they're part of the problem, but they're only part of the problem. I think that we as a country are isolating ourselves, how we live, who do we associate with, and all of those things, and how our political geography is divided, whether it's through redistricting, and many different things. I mean, if you take a look, and there's, as you know, Evan, if you take a look, just the cables exacerbate this, they all do that, but how people live now, 20 years ago, 75% of people were likely to live by somebody of an opposite political party next to them. Their neighbor, 75% of people were likely to have a neighbor, if they were a Republican, to be a Democrat. Today, 75% of people are likely to live by somebody exact same political party as themselves. And so you not only have this, I tune into Fox, I tune into MSNBC, I live in this district because it was designed this way, or the state it was designed to stay. How people live and associate now is a much more polarized way. And so the reason why these two are financially successful, I mean, you have to give Roger Ailes, in how much you hate what's happened with MSNBC and Fox, there's a market, and there's a market for it.
Responding to demand.
And the market is a much more polarized thing. And we have had leaders elected on both sides of the aisle who I think have had an opportunity, and I would say Bush as well as Obama, and have not always confronted. I think it's going to take somebody with a serious discipline to confront their own supporters and really confront them and say, this is not the way the country needs to run. Confront the media, confront a lot of different people, because the country is now in a position where if we don't change that dynamic, it's going to only get worse.
Does the polarization of the media create polarized politics, or the reverse?
Well, I think they're happening simultaneously.
Are they a byproduct of our politics, or are politics a byproduct of them?
The chicken or the egg? I think it's I think it's happening simultaneously. I think it's occurring in the country, and then they're exacerbating it, and then they exacerbate it, and it occurs more, and so it's a cycle.
It's a cycle. Let me ask you about social media, and whether social media, as part of this conversation, is making the problem better or worse. In the same way that you say, Matthew, that people tend to self-select based on what they already think, the network. We all curate our Twitter feeds, and often we curate them, maybe not everybody, but we often curate them to reflect our worldview. We tend to follow people we like. Sometimes we follow people we don't necessarily agree with just to add a little spice to it, but we've kind of isolated ourselves into these pods. And I wonder if that's a contributing factor to this. It is something that is vastly different this last cycle than previous cycles, and is likely to be more of a factor going forward.
I'm sort of evolving on that, Evan. I actually think that Twitter's expanding my universe and thinking.
Not shrinking it, but expanding.
Yeah, no, because I just find that I'm finding new thoughts, new ideas. It's exposing me to a lot more information rather than less, I think.
I agree with Mark on that. I actually think Twitter has now become one of the dominant channels of information. It's no longer, it's not even really a social network. It's bigger than CNN.
It's a newswire.
They have more effect on sharing of news than CNN does now. Yeah, they have bigger effect than AP, Associated Press now. And I've when I get things on there and there's stuff I would never read, but because somebody puts it on there and posts it and said, oh, that's interesting, and it's a different perspective on it. Some of it is very bitter. I don't think some of it serves purpose. Some things people say when they don't say, as you know, it's like an email. When you can't say it to somebody's face, you say things a lot worse. People say a lot of things that they wouldn't normally say if they were in this room to us. But I think it's a welcome addition to the news to a news service, actually.
Yeah. Is it creating a better educated electorate?
I think it is in many ways. Yeah, I think it's creating a really fertile universe of additional news sources that I never would have gotten before, and information sources.
I don't know if I think that we're in a time where we have more knowledge and less wisdom. I think
Explain.
I think that we now have access to more information and more things and more pieces of stuff, but less ability to sit back and put it all together in a universal way of like, how does this fit together? How does this change my worldview? How does this affect me in a broad way? And our leaders, I think, are much in our students in college, and I think all of us, is we have all of this information and all of this bits and pieces of stuff, but I think we're less wise, actually, than we were when we didn't have all of this, and that we had to struggle through things on that. I just think there's a difference between having a lot of knowledge and having a lot of wisdom.
Is that a fixable problem?
I don't know. I'll push back a little bit on that. I think that, and I really have an evolved position on Twitter because since you can't burn anything you put out there, I did a Twitter rant years ago that I'd love to burn now, but
you could have deleted it.
Well, I think the fingerprints are out there forever.
Are they? Okay.
Yeah. Somebody's got it.
Yeah. So you were going to say
Well, I just think that what I'm discovering is that it's not just more knowledge, but I think that 140 characters is an entry to an encyclopedia. It's a gateway to more information, and as I get more information, I become more knowledgeable. I think that as I get more knowledgeable, I think more broadly about some of these things, and I feel like, and I think that that's happening more broadly, and I'm optimistic about how technology is going to have an impact on our broader knowledge.
Let me flip it around and ask from the perspective of the people in politics and in policy-making positions and in campaigns. Last weekend, I talked to both of you about this. I was with Jim Baker and Joe Califano in College Station at the Philosophical Society meeting. Baker served in the Ford, Reagan, and H.W. Bush administrations. Califano served in Kennedy, Johnson, and Carter. Both of them were saying, we can't imagine what it would have been like to be in the White House, to be president, to be in administration in the era of Twitter, or in the era of the media tools that we now have available. It would have been a very, very different experience. Back then there were 3 channels, largely. Baker probably experienced a little bit more of the cable revolution than Califano did, but the point is, it's a vastly different world. So these things are not going anywhere. These changes and these tools are here. So from the perspective of, say, the Obama administration, how are they using those tools to influence this conversation from the other side in? How are they, what are you seeing in terms of how smart they're getting at using this stuff?
I'm going to say, and maybe this won't answer your question, but I'm going to say 2 things about this situation. first, and Mark and I were involved in, which nobody had ever done at the White House before when President Bush got there, was setting up an entity called the Office of Strategic Initiatives, whose sole idea was to wall off from the day-to-day so that you could look forward some certain period of time and try to map out what you wanted to do as opposed to be consumed by that day, which is what happens in a huge part of the communications at the White House. That was very helpful, I think. I think the Obama administration learned from that. I think future administrations have to figure out a way to wall off a certain amount of people from the day-to-day grind of like, how do I respond to this? I got this inquiry, what am I going to do? Because if you do that, everybody's consumed by that and nobody is thinking forward and nobody's thinking, what should we do 6 months from now? What should we do a year from now? How we're going to do this? The other problem with this, and if you look at the history of how politicians in the last, since Lincoln or before Lincoln, the problem this has created is every administration and leader has to be perfect from day one. Has to be perfect and consistent, quote unquote, from day one. It doesn't allow somebody to educate themselves. It doesn't allow somebody to change as they learn what's going on in the country. It doesn't allow evolution of people on different issues because you have to be perfect, because if you're not perfect and if you give a speech or say something on day one and go to Denver and say a different, so slightly tweak it because you learned something on day two, you're called inconsistent.
The YouTube videos go up side by side.
Everything, and look at who this person is.
Right.
And it used to be, and there was tales told of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln would give a speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He'd get a response from the crowd. He'd go to Chicago, give a slightly different speech. He'd go to Detroit, another different speech. By the time he got through of 12 speeches, he'd get to the end, and then he'd have something that perfected that they basically represented the country.
Today he'd be a flip-flopper.
He'd be inauthentic or whatever he'd happen to be.
Right.
That's part of the problem, I think, in the way leaders try to govern and people try to get elected to office today is they're not allowed to grow in the course of their time.
And that's on the media. The media has to own that, Mark.
I think so. Just as a bit of context, just to sort of frame how radically things have changed. It's just funny to think back that in the 2000 campaign we didn't have BlackBerries. It was just that fairly recently. Of course, Al Gore did because he invented the internet, but actually it's because Al Gore had a BlackBerry that there was a recount, because right as he was going up to deliver his concession speech,
Hooley.
Michael Hooley, I think, got a note from Donna Brazile saying stop, but it was because of the technology of RIM that created the recount in 2000. Flash forward, I'll just say that I was thankful that I wasn't thankful. I didn't feel like I had any choice in it because I just felt like I'd been through the human microwave too many times and had no brain cells left. So I had no interest in trying to be part of this last campaign. Not that anybody would have any interest in me being part of it either, but I did. Obviously, a lot of our old friends were involved, and I would talk to them fairly regularly. And I can just tell you that on both sides, just the speed and the impact of social media and and technology on campaigns, I'm not sure I would have survived. I mean, it's just, and they were miserable. I mean, it was not like, not that presidential campaigns are fun, but they were just crushed. I mean, it's just like daily crush. And a lot of that is just because of the power and speed of technology and social media, that it is a second-to-second thing. And as Matthew said, it's very difficult under those circumstances to be able to pull back and say, okay, what are we doing next week or a month from now, when you're responding to everything virtually all the time. The other thing that I think I think what's happening, and from my vantage point, is a benefit from technology, because I'm a revolutionist, because I think our institutions are totally out of sync with the country and they need to be overdone, and they need to be thrown out, from our financial institutions in New York to our governmental institutions to our political institutions. They're all products of a bygone era with huge cracks in them. We keep trying to re-cement them, and they no longer really fit where the country is technology. To me, we are on the verge of being a broken democracy. The United States is on the verge of being a broken democracy.
as you watch Washington, D.C. over the last year and a half, in the inability to come to any consensus on the major issues without some, let's push this off for 2 months, whether it's the sequester thing or the debt ceiling bill or whatever it happens to be, faults on all sides of this, that nobody can come to the middle. It's like a dodgeball game where everybody's afraid to go to the middle because they're afraid to get pelted in the middle, and they're unwilling, and so we cannot actually do the things we need to do. Everybody knows on both sides of the aisle we have to have entitlement reform. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows on both sides of the aisle we have to have cuts in Pentagon spending. Everybody knows it. And everybody really knows that we have to change the way we raise revenue in this country in a dramatically different way. Everybody knows that on both sides of the aisle, but they're unwilling to do that. To me, this is going to be at some point, not exactly like it, but technology is what allowed the Arab Spring to emerge. If technology hadn't been in place, if people hadn't had cell phones, if they couldn't communicate each other, people would feel isolated and would be unwilling to rise up. But because of the fact people felt there was 100,000 or 200,000 other people around, they were willing to rise up and do something about that. I think people more and more are disengaging from Washington, D.C. and disengaging from the institutions because they have a way to talk to each other and they have a way to go on Craigslist. I mean, Katrina was a perfect example. People under age 30 didn't say, let's call FEMA up and get something done. They got on Craigslist and looked for things on Craigslist to ship on their own to Louisiana in the midst of that. I think the technology is going to increasingly create a situation where the public out there is more and more disconnected from what's going on in Washington, D.C.
Matthew talks, Mark, about institutions being cracked and that we, rather than re-cement them, we have to essentially blow them up and start over. Is the media one of those institutions that's cracked, that needs to be overturned or blown up?
I think that's happening. I think that's happening.
Is it happening quickly enough?
Yeah, well, we'll see, but they're only a reflection of everything else that Matthew's talking about, and I've spent a considerable time thinking about disruption, and that's a class that I taught last fall. Where are the disruptive elements coming from in our society? Just a couple of thoughts. One is that Matthew's right. The one thing I saw among the younger students that I was teaching is that they have a strong skepticism about the traditional channels and institutions. They're skeptical about government. They're skeptical about political parties. They are passionate, and they have a real civic DNA about changing the world. And that's not translating into apathy. They're finding different channels like NGOs, entrepreneurship, really interesting ways of manifesting their ways to change the world, because they're not just going to accept that things are all screwed up and they can't do anything. They've got this intelligence, they've got technology, and they've got innovative ideas. So they're like water in the cracks of all this cracking institutions. So I'm encouraged by that. I'm also, I'm encouraged by what's happening at No Labels. I think that's just an example of the market kind of leading politics, where you get outside of Washington and people are, as Matthew was saying, they know what needs to be done, and they are not, they're passionate Republicans and passionate Democrats, but they understand we have to come together and we have to give a little bit from each side, and so that's why we're seeing such traction from this No Labels.
But yes, say a word just for the benefit of the people in the audience. We've referenced No Labels a couple times. Last night, Ambassador Olson made a point of saying how pleased he was and Mrs. Olson is to be members of No Labels. I just think for people's benefit, give us the 2-minute elevator speech on that.
I appreciate it because
you can't really talk about it because it doesn't have a label.
Without your label,
this thing that we do, this thing that we've been working on. Yeah. Well, we started a couple of years ago, and it's been a very interesting evolution, because we started with the idea that there are these very powerful interests in Washington that are fueling the hyperpartisanship, and again, we could have a long conversation about how and why that's done, but basically it translates into a situation where you have a lot of public servants in Washington whose reflex would be to do what I would describe as the right thing, or adult behavior, or work across political lines in a collegial, civil fashion, in a bipartisan way, to cooperate, occasionally compromise, to give a little. But whenever they do that, they get penalized. So it's a system where that kind of behavior gets penalized rather than rewarded because of these interests that are out there, most of which their interests are to maintain the status quo, not to have any progress or change, which is not where the country is at all. You get outside of Washington and people are just aghast at that sort of behavior, and say, with the, arguably at a time we have some of the greatest challenges ever, and yet we have this sort of shirts and skins issue where people say, if my party can't win, then screw it, we're not going to do it if we can't get political points. So the idea was to create a citizens movement that would provide cover, an electronic blanket, and a reward system for people to do the right thing. Now, initially, it's been an interesting evolution because at first I thought, well, maybe this is this broad coalition of the broad center of America. Well, we quickly learned that's a kind of a rabbit hole where you can disappear down into a pretty unproductive discussions pretty quickly because people have very different views about what that is. I mean, your view of what what the middle is maybe different than somebody else. But we also realized that, as Matthew said, we didn't want to exclude people who were on the far left or the far right, because in order to get things done, you got to bring everybody together, and you can't. So, and we didn't want to just, we didn't want to just throw rocks at the system. We wanted to figure out how to work with the system in order to make it work again. Because my analogy is, as I think I may have mentioned earlier, is that you have these interests of sort of shoveling sand into the engine of government. So what we wanted to do as we evolved to a point where we said, well, maybe we should address the systemic issues that are creating the problems, like redistricting reform, like primary reforms, maybe campaign finance reform. Then we looked around and said, A, there's other people doing that, and B, they're very long-term things, and we want to have more immediate traction and more impact immediately. And then we evolved to a point where we've really found a sweet spot, which is to say, let's just focus on problem solving. Let's focus on what I'd call process reforms that aren't really left or right issues. And this gets to where I'm saying we're just going to try and get in, oil the engine of government, work on things like filibuster reform, like give the president, when he appoints somebody to a position in government, give him 90 days and it's an up or down vote. Unlike a situation where, like me, I was appointed by President Bush to a position at the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which oversees Radio Free Europe. I didn't get confirmed for 4 years. And it wasn't just me. We couldn't even get a quorum of the board to meet because they couldn't confirm anybody else. And it was literally just, they wouldn't confirm one guy because the Republicans wouldn't confirm a Democrat. And it went back years and years, like a Hatfield and McCoy's deal where nobody could remember how it began, but we're going to screw them because they've been screwing us. And so, like I said, that agency was like, arguably an important agency of government, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of judicial slots that are open. Tim Geithner was over there trying to save the world from an economic meltdown with interns and secretaries because they couldn't fill jobs in the Treasury Department. So we've outlined 12 reforms that we think will just help make government work again. And by the way, the one that's gotten the most traction is an idea called no budget, no pay, which is budget is policy in Washington. And if that's the job. When you by creating a budget, as you know in your business, that creates how your strategic plan for your business, right? Your budget sets the agenda. Well, same thing in Washington. We elect them to write a budget. The Senate hasn't passed a budget since before the iPad was put out. And so there are huge consequences that we have what we call continuing resolutions, which literally means we kick the can down the road. And not just the can, but that means policies. And so the idea was we create an incentive, or rather a disincentive system, or an incentive system to pass a budget, which is if you don't do it, you're not going to get paid.
You don't get paid.
Which is what happens to the rest of us in our lives, right? We don't get our job, we don't get paid. So our idea was to apply that more broadly to the budgets and appropriations process, which I'm very confident is going to now happen because we have 100 co-sponsors for that. But it popped up just 3 weeks ago as a solution to the debt ceiling crisis. So those are the kind of things, and now we have 40 members of Congress, 20 Republicans and 20 Democrats who've signed up to be part of a Problem Solvers No Labels caucus. And as some of our members, Jim Chapman would know, that this is like the Blue Dog Democrats, who at one point were a pretty hardy band,
have been
decimated, as have been the Main Street Republicans, their counterparts. They took the name Republican out of the name a couple of weeks ago because they couldn't get enough Republicans to join. But my point is that when they were flourishing, Congressman, you can say a swing of 40 or 50 votes is a huge block, right? Particularly if they're from both parties. So we went from 25 to 40 just in the last couple of weeks after we announced it about a month ago, and I think we'll get to 50 or 60 pretty soon, or 70 or 75 by the end of the year. But my point about this is that, and this goes to a point Dave Weigel and I were just talking about, that there's some really encouraging signs. I think the ice is cracking, you know, and
finally.
Yeah, and there's some things happening. There's some progress. So we do tend to get to the, democracy is messy, and we do get to the edge of the cliff more often than we need to. But I see a lot of good things happening.
Before we get to the edge of the cliff and we open up for questions, are you hopeful that this is going to get fixed sometime soon?
I'm hopeful it's going to get fixed, but not under the current dynamics that we have.
Something big has to change.
I think that this is not a system that can be fixed with the institutions that are in place today. I just think
it does make you think from time to time the Chinese are onto something.
I mean, I just
nobody tweet that.
or do.
Yeah.
I just don't.
On the other hand, you're already working for MSNBC, so you'll be fine.
You're just gonna get a contract.
Right, seriously, yeah. I think your pay just went up.
I just don't. I think that we're gonna have little kind of balloon little successes here and there, but fundamentally, I think the way that the institutions are in place is flawed and is corrupt at its core, and the only way real change can happen is if we throw out the institutions.
Problem isn't product, it's brand and pitch.
This is a long answer to the question. The question is, on election night, if you saw me, I said that the problem is the Republican Party is a Mad Men party in a Modern Family world. I think that's part of the problem.
How many of those are ABC shows? I guess just one.
Just one.
Boy, you are good. Work here, man. Come on.
Here, I think that the middle is actually bigger than it's been. The middle. But the choices we have between the two are more extreme. And so if you look at, and there's this thing that's been repeated about after the 2000 election, I did this whole analysis about the number of people that are actually swing voters declined dramatically. And therefore people sort of pick their team. 48% of the country say, this is the team I'm on, this is who I am, I got an R on my back, and I'm gonna vote for everybody on the ticket that's an R. And then people that have a D on their back, 47 or 48, and so that people that actually split or swing really is small. But if you look at where people are in that, what they think about issues, take people that believe in large government as the answer to problems, that are socially liberal and are for a more progressive tax system, right? That group of people. That's about 22% of the country. And then you take a look at people that say, I'm for smaller government, much smaller government, I'm for a tax system that isn't progressive, and I'm more socially conservative. That's about 25% of the country. That's 48% of the country. 52% of the country is a mix. They're socially conservative, they might be, or they're socially liberal, or they might be conservative on fiscal issues, or they might believe in large government on this one hand, but believe in a tax system on the other hand. The problem is that we are increasingly giving them a choice that doesn't allow them, that only allows them to pick either between the 22 or 23% and the 25 or 26%. I think fundamentally, the Republicans, you're right, there is a big message problem, there's a big brand problem, I think. I think there is a very successful message that Republicans could offer in this. But it's got to be a message that changes. It's not just about we're against anything that is the quote unquote the collective. If I were Republicans, I'd be talking about the importance of community, but community not defined. If you could define the choice between the Democrats want a collective that is done out of Washington, D.C. The Republicans want us to come together in a much more localized fashion in here. The problem today is the public thinks the choice is between people that believe purely in the individual and people that believe in the federal government. And at a time when most of the public thinks we can't do this on our own, we can't just do this by ourselves, we have to do this together, they're going to choose, even though they don't like the federal government solution to it, they're going to choose that because that's the only option they've been given.
I think that that this is part of a media narrative too, that Republicans lost, and they've lost the last 2 elections or 5 of the last 6, so this is, we're not going to see another Republican administration for another 100 years, which is kind of what everybody was saying about in 2004 after Bush won re-election in 2004. There's going to be this Republican hegemony, into the unforeseeable future. So I think that, I think if somebody like Mitch Daniels had wanted to be president today, I think if there had been a qualified, solid Republican who ran a good campaign, I think he would have won. So I don't think that, I think with a good candidate, and I think there's some great young Republican candidates in the wings. I think with this sort of, I think Matthew's on it in terms of the message of community, a community localized message. And you spend enough time in the desert, you find water, and I think that's where the Republicans are now. But I don't think the problem's nearly as severe as the sort of meta narrative would suggest.
I think the Democrats, I agree with Mark, I think the Democrats, and I'm, as Evan said, I'm purely independent these days. I think the Democrats have misread the results of this election. They have misread it to believe that the vast majority of the American public wants more power vested in Washington, D.C., and wants them more involved in people's lives. They've misread that. I actually think the president's inaugural address is an example of a misreading of where the country fundamentally is. The interesting thing about what's going on also is the country is simultaneously becoming more devout and more secular at the same time. When you think about our politics has become more polarized, our spirituality and our religion in this country has also become more polarized. We have a higher percentage of people that are more secular than any time in our country's history, and we have a higher percent of people that describe themselves as more devout than we have in the last 50 years. Simultaneously, those two things are going on.
First of all, I had this my own evolution, which was inspired in part by George W. Bush when he was governor, and most of you were here and remember that as a time when did a lot of bipartisan work with Governor Bullock, but that was also at a time when, prior to that, as you recall, with Gingrich and the 94 government shut down, the Republican message had been kind of like what it is now, which is, shut down government, a very anti-angry message. And then along comes this guy, George W. Bush, with a very, talking about compassionate conservatism, a different kind of Republican, and attracted me then as a conservative Democrat and independent to be a Republican because he was talking about those ways, he was talking about issues like immigration reform and education reform, two issues that I happen to be very passionate about. So we went into that 2000 campaign, and Matthew was running the numbers, and he said, first of all, it was George W. Bush's instinct. I mean, he'd been here, he'd governed, he had a very immigrant-friendly, not just attitude, but policies and language. So that was just his natural instinct. But politically, Matthew said, in order to win that vote in 2000, we had to have 40% of the Hispanic vote in order to win. Other things sort of being equal, and we got 41. The interesting thing was that 6 months later, Matthew walks in and says, hey, by the way, folks, if we get that exact same percentage next time, we lose. So now this time it's got to be 43%, and we got 44. And so, I mean, you just think about those demographic practicalities, and then you have a guy running for the Republican nomination where he talks about self-deportation and got what percentage of Hispanics?
27.
27.
I mean, I was going to say, you would be exceedingly deluded and close to mentally ill if you think you can win elections in this country and not win Latino voters. I mean, and there is a number of Republicans that are exceedingly deluded still. You can't, and it's only going to, as you look at the numbers and project the numbers out, Texas will become a two-party state, in my view, again, on the verge, and a Democrat could win a statewide election in 2018 because of the growth of the Latino population in Texas. And 2018 is, I think, the next opportunity. But it's not just Texas, Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, Florida. It's North Carolina, Iowa, Illinois, North Dakota. It states all over the country that this growth, it's the fastest, it's grown 400% as a share of the electorate in 20 years. And if Republicans want to be a minority party for the next generation, they can ignore Latinos. They know it, but there is this constant tension between appeals to the sort of put a wall up around the border language. And trust me, we tested all of this. The right way to talk about a lot of these issues as a Republican in California and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Most Latinos believe in a very strong immigration system. They believe that if somebody is undocumented and commits a crime, they should be kicked out. They believe in a whole bunch of things that would be considered conservative on this. But as Mark said, Republicans have gone so far to appeal to a diminished group of voters, which is white males in this country, which is this past election showed them to be the smallest number they've ever been, and it's only dropping. And if you add Latino voters to single women, which is increasing, and you add it to people that don't go to church every week, that don't go to church regularly, and then you add it into all of the other factors, it gets very hard for Republicans to win if they can't win Latinos. And the other one that none of us talked about, I know we're almost done here, is Asian voters have now become almost as problematic for Republicans as Latino voters.
73%.
And Asian voters is the second fastest growing group in this country.
Yeah, 73%. Amazing. All right, I'm told we have to stop. Pretty fantastic, huh? Yeah. Let's give these guys a hand.